racial slurs, 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 racial racial slurs, 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 racial I can't say racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slur, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial no, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial racial slurs, racial racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial racial slur, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial 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 slur, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slur, racial no, racial slur, racial slurs, 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 racial no, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial slur. It doesn't even sound like a word. Racial slurs, racial slurs, racial racial slurs, racial no, racial slurs, racial slurs, racial 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 slurs, racial slurs,